So this is panel number 2 for me, but panel number 1 for this fabulous group of experts. So I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody. So this is our second panel on sustainable built design in particular. And I think we've got a little bit of a different bent on it, but I think you're going to hear a lot of common themes, as we've heard all day, around how do we tie together all the different pieces of sustainability. Now, the trick for this panel is we're right before lunch. So we're going to do our best to answer and have a few conversations up here and then engage all of you because we're very interested in learning in particular from this big group of experts that we have in front of us. So I'm going to start with Mark at the far end, but I'm going to offer up a question to everybody to kind of get us a little bit grounded. So I'd like to start with why does a city need a sustainability agenda when considering the built environment? I don't think it's always given everywhere across the U.S. as well as the globe. And so I'd like to hear what people think about that as a starting point. So Mark?
Sure. Okay. Nice to be with you all today. I would say it's important for cities to lead on sustainability planning, especially as the developments, because sustainability is very local, right? One sustainability strategy that may be defined by some framework that works in California may not work in Detroit or vice versa, right? Like water is a good example. Water in California is maybe the top over energy because the energy's pretty far along the path, whereas here we're in the Great Lakes, water is abundant, be good stewards of it, but maybe it's not a higher priority. So I would say that, and just to give direction to designers and developers who are looking for where to go. I mean, there's so many programs out there. You've got LEED, you've got the Living Buildings Challenge, Living Communities Challenge, WELL, eco districts, life cycle cost analysis programs and stuff. And it's like, which one do I pick? Like, which one is appropriate? And so for cities to be the lead and set that with an agenda is very helpful, and will also create synergies within the city with everybody kind of working towards the same goals.
John?
Hey everyone. So yeah, I think for us, certainly it's localized, and I think just sort of the big picture is for us when we think about, as architects and designers, life safety is sort of, something that we have to do every day. But if we're not designing for the next 50 to 100 years, then we're not living up to that responsibility. Like, life safety is different now than it used to be. And I think that's something that we think about. So why is sustainability important? So, Detroit is a fairly unhealthy city for a lot of different reasons. If you think about our history, we want to be around, and we want our grandkids to thrive and our kids to thrive. So I think sustainability at just a very basic level is for what health and wellness, so that we can thrive. And I think that's really what we try to remind ourselves of every day when we come to work.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and certainly one that drives me too. Now, Maria, this one's really right up your alley.
Yeah, and here for the controversy. I actually think there's already so many plans, right? And I think climate plans are great, and they're one strategy, and we actually have one coming up that we're going to publish, but it's really about embedding sustainability and climate notions and resiliency in everything we do. I think having a direction and sort of targets and aspirations are great, and that is something that we're committed to doing. But really, it's about knowing that, we're going to continue to develop, we're going to continue to do work. We have a lot of data nowadays, and it's really about embedding a lot of those systems and information into both existing projects, because honestly, there are plans that sometimes take years to develop, and then by the time it gets published, it's almost like, oh my gosh, the emergency is now. So it's really about sort of deploying those ideas really quickly, being really informed by the conditions on the ground. Like we said, things are very localized, but it's really about not letting sort of your plan be an obstacle for limiting what we can do, and really, especially in a time like this where things are very urgent, I think we need to start being a little bit more nimble in terms of like planning, and also sort of reacting really fast to these solutions, and having like short-term sort of sprints towards getting towards our goals.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Maria. It's both bottom up and top down, which we heard from the other panel too. So, Roberto?
Thank you. I would double down a little bit on there's so many systems and different things that we can use that having cities kind of publish it all in one place is super helpful for designers. But I would also like to bring up an analogy of from Bill Gates' book on climate. He talks about 3 different levers that we need to push all at the same time in the same direction. Those are policy, technology, and the market. So I think having cities kind of say like, this is a technology that's out there that helps companies develop that technology. That's really critical in electrification, mass timber, any of these new, very innovative methods that we have to kind of fight this battle against climate change.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that was definitely an interesting read for sure. When we think about sustainability in the built environment, one of the threads we've already heard a little bit from a couple of you is around that dichotomy of living in a city with heavy industry. And I think, that's certainly true for us here in Detroit, in Michigan, and I think a parallel in other parts of the nation and the globe. I was wondering if each of you could talk a little bit, maybe Roberto, we'll start with you, either about that influence on projects or, again, on kind of the bigger picture and the impact that it has on our sustainability planning.
Yeah, great question. We've done some master planning efforts helping out Bedrock in terms of how do you look at, for example, the expected growth in cities over time, and kind of the way we look at it is, and it goes back to TOD, transit-oriented development, which is what you really need is the super diverse mix of different uses in communities that will get us to drive our cars less and to walk around in our neighborhoods. So the challenge of industrial being there is something that these TOD plans is really good at in terms of how do we transition from something that was and get the community's input to turn it into something that's makes where we live healthier.
Yeah. And Maria, I bet this is an everyday issue for you.
Yeah, I actually I have a deep passion sort of in sort of industrial planning, and I did my master's in architecture, and my capstone was around like mining and heavy industry, because so much of sort of humans like what we have extracted from the earth is like not only leaving sort of scars on the built environment, right, as like we see these large assembly plants, but they're also leaving scars in communities. And I think there's a huge recognition, in the city of Detroit, these communities, communities of color have been the front lines of industry. And I think there is an opportunity right now, because so much funding and innovation is coming in, to really rethink about those industrial processes and really, challenge industrial partners to drive down, energy and pollution, because there are technologies out there that are making that possible. I think too, there's, we live in a blip of time, right? And if you think back about Detroit, 100 years, when there was a lot of concrete crushers on the East Riverfront, and now we just celebrated, and shout out to the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy and the city and all the partners that, made the project possible. But we have a beautiful riverfront that was otherwise very heavily industrialized. And now we have a beautiful pedestrian, cyclist, kid-friendly, family-friendly, tourist-friendly bridge to bridge. And those are examples of sort of like being aspirational and hopeful, and not think that industry is going to be there forever. That might be the case right now, and we should solve for some of those industrial harms, but we should also think, what's going to happen next, and how do we reserve this land for a public benefit?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to echo the hopeful part, because if we don't have optimism, Diane Hoskins, we have 2 CEOs, kind of unusual, but it works really well, by the way. She's amazing. She always reminds us about how important it is that we are, optimistic in everything that we do. And I think this is a topic where you have to really continue to look at it honestly, but also optimistically. And I think for us, and we're in the architecture business specifically, and the impact that architecture can have, but I think in this case, it's really about, specifically in Detroit, how do we take these buildings that were once used for something that may have a lot of, they may be contaminated in different ways, and really focus on cleaning them up and saving them. Not just, in some cases, yes, we have to tear them down and safely remove them. But, there's a tremendous amount of carbon that's been spent to produce these buildings, not just downtown, but in the neighborhoods. And we really have to come together to figure out plans to keep them and reuse them and celebrate them in a different way. Because if we just tear them down and build something else new, talking about sustainability is not sustainable at all. And it's a very unhealthy practice. So, we actually think that, especially in Detroit, there's, 30 years worth of buildings that we should be, reusing. And we really shouldn't be building as much as maybe we think, or as architects as we want to, because it's a shiny new thing. So I think for us, it's a real focus.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the cities I've done development in outside of Detroit look at former industrial sites as opportunities for new mixed use development or change of use. What I find unique about Detroit and what I love since I've been here for about 1.5 years, is the city's very much looking to keep industry in the city limits, right? It is a core jobs market here. It's part of Detroit's history, being in manufacturing. And so when we do that, what types of industry are we bringing into the city limits, and how are we making responsible choices about what we want co-located next to population centers and residential communities? I mean, I think everybody here realizes that former industry has created a lot of environmental justice issues with people living next door, air quality issues, truck traffic issues, that sort of thing. So as we look to the next wave of industry that's going to be co-located next to residential centers, how do we make it more sustainable? How do we mitigate the impacts on neighborhoods and communities while still keeping that economic growth and those jobs co-located to where people can walk to an industrial building? That's one of the Bedrock has an industrial campus down in Delray, and my team's job is to build the infrastructure. And we were looking at it and we were saying, well, it's right next to the Gordie Howe, all this infrastructure connecting across 75. And so our site plan has sidewalks in it. And I can't tell you how many people came and said, like, why are you building sidewalks in an industrial development? So I'm like, well, because there's like 6 new pedestrian connections across to the neighborhood across the street. Maybe people will walk here. And people were like, oh, well, that's interesting, right? And so I think rethinking like what that looks like, and then making sure that the industry that needs to still exist, that may not be the best to put next to neighborhoods, finds a home in a more appropriate place.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think that it demonstrates how all those different angles of sustainability weave together, particularly with, what is that development? I spent a little time talking about the Gordie Howe Bridge on the previous panel too. I'd like to spend a minute or two not just in Detroit, but Maria, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your solar program, just because I think it's phenomenal. And I think it pulls on some of the threads that we've heard from all the panelists here today. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you all have approached that and where you think it's going to go.
Yeah, thinking about, pushing the boundaries. We are hard at work engaging communities across Detroit to really ask the question of, would using some of the vacant land that we have be appropriate for solar fields that could power city buildings in a clean way. And the approach has been really sort of radical, I think. The mayor announced the initiative, and there was a form that was open for neighborhoods to sort of like apply. So it wasn't, this long exercise of planning, and I'm a planner by training, and, for all planners, we were just like, wait, we need a big, long plan. But at the same time, it was really interesting to sort of just like jump in and really get into those conversations with communities and sort of start asking the questions, look around where you live. Do you see 10 to 20 acres of, land that you think this could be an option? And for the past 6 to 8 months, we've been engaging in deep conversations with community organizations, residents that live both within sort of some of the parcels of land where, the fields are being considered, adjacent, to really think about, is solar a land use that we want to see in Detroit inside city limits? The mayor, pitched it incredibly, communities all over the US, Chicago, Cincinnati, are building these fields in rural communities, right? And we have an opportunity to really start testing the waters in terms of like how that could look like. So we are sort of, working with community members. The most radical thing that I'm about to leave out is that as we assemble the land for these solar fields, there's a community benefit, right? So it's not just coming in and plopping, solar. It's about, okay, what happens to the adjacent residents that want to live next to these solar fields? Like, what would you like to see in your home? Is it weather station? Is it fixing your roof, your porch? Is it having solar yourself on your house so that you can lower your energy bills? So it's, to me, really pushing the boundary. And there's a few steps before the projects are fully sort of completed. And yeah, we are going through the steps right now. So if you guys are interested, definitely tune in. We'll be having lots of more conversations.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead.
Okay. Maria, so in that program, who gets the benefit of the solar energy, and how, like, where do the electrons go and where do the RECs go?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, because we don't have enabling legislature to do distributed solar, the power would be powering city facilities. So this is truly to manage a portfolio of buildings. We have, a portfolio of sites of 300 sites and buildings themselves over 130. So we're really talking about the largest city of Michigan and the municipal operations being powered by clean energy, which is huge for us.
Have you talked a little bit, has it been mostly just a green field of solar, or are we looking at ideas for on top of the roof of?
Yeah, both. Like, we are considering both, but right now, because we are truly looking at utility scale, is, looking at fields. Yeah.
By the way, just as a plug, go to the website because they have an incredible interactive map that shows all of this. But it really, there's a lot of pride. I know I felt, and I'm sure a lot of people did, in seeing how quickly this came together and the innovation behind it and stuff. I mean, leadership is at the core, both public and private, of making any sort of progress. And it's just, I know I felt a lot of pride when, you see things like this come from our city. So congrats.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things I most liked about it was the engagement component, because you do go check out the website, but the intent was you tell us where you think it should go. And I think that's something that can really help with the renewable build that's necessary in order to get us to our climate goals, particularly on the mitigation side. So I was wondering if others have examples. I mean, that's an outstanding example of a community engagement, but I know we wanted to dig in a little bit more in this conversation about some of that engagement type work. And so I was wondering if the other three of you, or Maria, if you've got another example of good community engagement, that'd be helpful.
I have so many, and because I have so many colleagues in the room that I would love to shout out, but I think what's important about community engagement and what I've learned over the years working in the city is that it truly takes a village, and if you really sort of want to be committed to reaching the right people in the room, you develop relationships with community leaders. I'm lucky enough to have been introduced to the Detroitisit side, where, there's like an abundant wealth of community activists. And my neighbor right there. And, it's really about listening and knowing that once you gain that trust, you show up, that people will bring others to your meetings to really, kind of engage in that collaboration. But it takes time. It takes a lot of time and effort. So often we're restricted by tight deadlines. We talked about grants earlier and how quick they come about, and we have to do a component with community engagement. There's always projects and they're running on timelines. So we're always sort of being tested to get it right and engage the right people, but there's always sort of limitations.
If I can chime in there, we do a lot of outreach for public agencies. I'm based in California, so a lot of it has happened there. But something really successful we've been able to do is, pre-pandemic, most things were in person, but we've really been able to supplement that and not take over it, but still have both. Where in digital events or online, you get a much more diverse cut of the population that's living there and much more diverse opinions and everything. And we've developed these series of digital tools and games. Some of them are through like just Miro, like dot voting exercises, or using Maptionaire, which we can create like dynamic maps for them to go and like, as you say, choose areas. So really like developing this toolkit of digital tools to help engagement and get people to be able to voice their opinion, because that's just critical to the outcome of any project, we've learned.
That's really cool.
I'm not going to share a specific example, but I would just say that, obviously public agencies sort of have a responsibility. And I think the city of Detroit does a really great job. Communities are often really engaged already. It's just showing up to ask the right questions and listen. On the private side, though, it doesn't happen as much as it should, which is why I think from a policy perspective, the community benefits agreement, sort of, even though it was probably controversial at the time in the city because it was new, it has actually been significantly impactful in delivering some real change. And I know we're just starting to see that kind of come through on larger projects in the city, but otherwise the conversations wouldn't have been had. So it's just more of a general comment that, again, back to public and private working together, we need the legislation and the policies in place to sometimes help push along things that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and I'm going to argue that the private sector would be more successful if they did more community engagement.
Don't disagree.
So, from my experience.
So I've only been here for a year and a half. I have not gone through a CBO process here in Detroit, so I can't comment as to how that process is working and everything. But I do agree with you. I think whether it's a legislated process that you are obligated to go through as a developer, I think that is important for cities to have, because left to their own devices, developers will find a way to drive up their economic returns, right? That's the business we're in. That being said, like if you're lucky enough to have a mission-driven developer, which I like to believe Bedrock is, in your backyard, having that community engagement to steer where and what the most appropriate use of community benefits funds is, as opposed to having the private sector kind of mandate or dictate what they think is best for the community, is important to structure those in a neutral setting where there can be objective conversations. So.
Yeah, that collaboration is really important. And to steal a quote from my good friend Carla Walker Miller, who moderated the last panel, to change everything, we need everyone. So I think that's a great way to think about it. All right, so we've benefited greatly from this discussion of experts, but we want to open it up to all of you because we can learn a lot from this room. So I'm going to go over here because I did not take this gentleman's question from the planning department earlier. Do we have microphones? I didn't yell it fast enough. Great, thank you.
So I'm a building inspector for the city of Detroit. I deal with vacant and abandoned buildings, and I hear about environmental justice. The thing that I always come to mind is not the lead water pipes or the industrial sites, but I think about the abandoned buildings that are full of lead and asbestos that are adjacent to neighborhoods where people live. The windows are blown out, and we have air blowing through these buildings 24/7 that, to me, is carrying these pollutants into the neighborhood. So I'm wondering is that reasonable to be concerned about environmental justice in those kind of settings versus the industrial settings?
I've done a lot of demolition in my career. I can say, in order of the level of concern about asbestos and lead like blowing from the buildings, I think depending on the content of asbestos, if it's friable, if it's disturbed and it's blowing directly into a neighbor's window, there's probably reasons to be concerned. Lead you have to ingest, right? So unless you have people walking into the buildings and eating the lead there, probably not as big of a concern. But I would say the city of Detroit's demolition program to address those is like second to none, really. Like I don't know how many buildings Detroit has demolished to alleviate that problem, but from a technical perspective, I would say that level of concern, as long as you're not entering the building and engaging with the materials, probably isn't huge.
I will say, as a former environmental regulator, we worry more about the industrial just because of the amount. So probably more from the scale perspective. And I do think that there would be opportunities to do air quality monitoring to get us a feel for, is that a place where we should be spending more time and focus? But I do think the demolition program is probably the tip of the spear in terms of dealing with it. Maria, did I jump in front of you?
No, I was just going to say that there's no more sustainable building than that it is already built. So like, in every case we will try to remediate. I would also argue that really vibrant communities sort of rely on having sort of like a density of building scale that's neighborhood, neighborhood scale. And we have so many beautiful buildings in Detroit, and I definitely think obviously the asbestos and lead questions are real, but not just in Detroit. I think they're typical of buildings built in a certain time. But really, for me, it's about like, how do we keep that craftsmanship from, the 1910s and 1920s? I live in a 1907 house, and I know that, I'm not going to find a house like that, that's new built. So it's really about preserving those materials.
Just to add real quick, I think the challenge there is it adds yet another cost to the higher cost of rehabilitating a building versus building a new one. That unfortunately is cheaper to build a new one, which is insane. So I'm looking for ways that we can kind of quantify those benefits of reusing the building. We've been working with our cost estimating teams, and at the moment it comes out to like a very low amount monetary wise if we try and quantify that. But I'm really interested in like, how do we equal the table by actually benefiting from the rehabilitation?
Is that like embodied carbon credits in markets? Yeah. Are there any markets you know of in the world that value that?
Some clients are starting to value it, thankfully, but.
And this is why policy design is an important part of this conversation too. Okay,
Exactly.
Another question right here in the front. I went the wrong way from the mic guy. Sorry, mic guy.
Hello. My name is Nico Larco. I'm a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of Oregon, and I run the Sustainable Cities Institute and the Urbanism Next Center. My question is really about, in a lot of the research we've done, it seems like something that helps with all aspects of sustainability is density. And it's interesting that we're partnering with Netherlands, which it seems like so many of the fantastic things that you can do there is because they have density. In the US, we haven't necessarily had much of a love affair with density. And so as we think about, planning for the city of the future, how do you think about density as being part of that equation in the context that we've got here in the US?
Well, we could even start by Detroit because we've got a density challenge in Detroit, right? And I'll speak just more to the urban core piece of this because maybe that relates a little bit more to density. I think we have a challenge, but also a massive opportunity in Detroit. The challenge is we have 3 times as few people living downtown as I'll call them sister Midwestern cities. We have about 7,000 people living downtown. We should have about 24,000 people living downtown if we were to compare ourselves against basically any other Midwestern city. So the opportunity, though, is we have significant building stock, like amazing building stock. If we can align the right incentives, which there are a lot of them out there, but I think we could probably do a better job on state historic tax credit, that portion. There are some things that we could do. We could transform a lot of these buildings to increase the density of people living. You get people living here and then everything else it's not really a chicken or the egg. You got to have some stuff down here for folks. But the reality is we need to create places for people to live and want to live and draw them here. We have as a state and an area, the Great Lakes area, we have a lot going for us. We have a lot going for us. And with each passing year with climate challenges ahead of us, it'll become a place that, people will likely seek out. So we have a lot of opportunity, even though we're behind the curve a lot, but we have an incredible opportunity. And the buildings we have in Detroit are really spectacular. I mean, you guys probably hear it, it, but when people come to Detroit, they look around, they go, oh my gosh, and part of that is because we didn't tear them down and build post-war buildings. We don't have a lot of 70s, 80s, 90s buildings. We have a lot of pre-war buildings, and they're incredible, and they're actually great for conversion. So yeah, I think that's from an architectural and sort of density point of view, we have a lot of opportunity.
All right, we're going to squeeze. I'm sorry, this woman has raised her hand both times, and I didn't get to her. So we're going to come back over here. And this will be our last question before lunch.
My name is Kim Rossino, and my business is Destination Detroit Tours. I've conducted tours for Detroiters for environmental justice, a lot of developers and investors coming into the city, not just tourists. I also worked on 3 master plans when I was in community development: Lower East Side Action Plan, Vacant Land Repurposing, East Jefferson Corridor Initiative, and a Greenways Master Plan for the city. So I understand the challenges and the benefits of vetting the community. Who better to say what the community looks like than the people who live there? It's not an easy process, but you learn a lot, and I, fully support that. What piqued me wanting to ask, and I'll direct the question to Mark, is when I was doing tours for Detroiters working for environmental justice, we did a lot of tours down to Delray. 48217, the most polluted zip code in Michigan. I heard from them, and I was green to it. I didn't know. I knew it was bad, but I didn't know how bad it was. And the more I learned, the scarier it kind of got. And when I hear people talk about not giving up, it seemed like people had given up because they couldn't fight the oil companies. It was easier to just acquiesce than fight because they got nowhere quickly. So when I hear, I know about the Gordie Howe Bridge and the development around Delray, and then Mark mentioned Bedrock's investment, I wonder how that looks. How do we invest in community and build around 48217 or right next to it without creating more problems for the community, the people that live there, the people who work there and choose to visit coming across that bridge? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So the oil industry down there in Delray, you see the big flares, and when you look at Zug Island on Google Earth, it's like literally black, right? You can tell that it is. Those are the types of industry I was referring to as like not being appropriate to be near urban centers, right? And so are those assets going to move and relocate in our generation? Probably not, but that's where I see policy and regulation coming into play. And I'll give an example of awesome policy that I've seen in action in Cleveland, actually. We have a master development there on the Cuyahoga River, and there's a former steam plant that was coal-fired, and we've been partnering with the local thermal provider there to talk about district energy, and we learned through that discussion that the coal-fired power plant was decommissioned in 2017 because in 2014, Obama passed a legislation that regulated NOx emissions on all coal-fired power plants. And so every coal-fired power plant in urban centers are doing the math to say, can I upgrade my facility to comply with the new regulation? And the regulation ticks up every year. And Corix made the conscious decision in 2017, we have to replace all of our furnaces. And so it is more economical for us to decommission it and switch over to a different location with gas-fired boilers. And so I think it's those types of regulation that's going to ultimately solve that. It's not something developers can do by themselves. We can do the best we can with the little parcels that we own, but it'll take generational change and foresight of cities to set the urban framework in a way that's more conducive to public health concerns.
And I would just add that, 48217, yes, absolutely, one of the most polluted areas. But I would challenge you, and I have actually met people from 48217, and there's a vibrant community there of like incredible community leaders. And I really don't want to discourage this idea of like skip over this zip code or skip over this community, because there's so much to learn in terms of leadership, of truly how do we do environmental justice advocacy. They're like a model, across the nation. So, going to these tours to visit the community, yes, is to sort of like acknowledge the harm, that this pollution is driving, but it's also about learning, how do we combat that and how do we push for those legislation changes? I was going to say something else, but it escaped me, and I know we're over time and we're hungry.
No, that's really good, Maria, because I think it adds the component of not only community engagement, but also how that then supports public policy development, which are the things that need to come together. So this was a great panel. Thank you so much, everybody. And thanks, everyone, for your attention. It's lunchtime.